Hello, Professor Lewenstein, and my full name is Karim Sardar, and I'm from Uzbekistan, and I'm the founder of the project Pizik, which is a project that makes science and physics accessible and simple for people in Uzbekistan and for people in Central Asia. So we're starting the new Science Communication with Pizik series, and our first guest is the Professor of Science Communication at Cornell University Arts and Science College, Dr. Bruce Lewenstein. Welcome, Professor Lewenstein.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Professor Lewenstein, for those who want to know more about you and more about your background and more about your work, can you introduce yourself? And if you had to summarize your work, what you do, and why you do it, can you summarize it in just sentences? And how would it be?
Yeah. So I'll try. So my name is Bruce Lewenstein. I'm a professor of science communication at Cornell University in the United States, where I have been for more than 35 years. I was one of those people who liked science but didn't want to be a scientist, and I discovered that science communication, writing about science and technology for the general public, was something that was really interesting. So I did that for a few years, and then after my undergraduate degree, and then I began to have questions about what's the role of science communication in the relationship between science and society. And so I went back to, I have a PhD in the history of science, and what I study is the history of how science and society interact, and particularly through science communication. So I teach science communication courses. I teach how to do science communication, but I also teach why to do science communication. And there's not a single answer to why. There are many reasons. So I've been involved in science communication. I stay very closely connected to professional science communicators. And I have been involved in science journalism, science in the movies, science museums, citizen science, which I think we might talk about later. I'm just learning about science, reels and TikToks and short videos like this. Of course, the field has changed a lot since I got into it. So I do all of those things.
I've read a lot of your articles and research papers in Journal of Science Communication, many science magazines. And for those of us, especially for students who are watching who will watch our interview, and especially students from Central Asia, what is science communication in simple terms? And for those who will watch our interview, and especially those students from Central Asia, which is where science communication is quite an emerging field, what is actually science communication, and how would you define it?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a single answer to what is science communication. I think of it as all of the ways that we can communicate about science and technology with non-science audiences. So, and I pretty much call it public communication to separate it from school. So some people would include formal schooling in science communication. I don't, but if people want to, that's okay with me. So it includes things like providing information about science, so science journalism, just explaining science, providing demonstrations of how science works. But it's also another element of it is getting people excited about science, which might not convey a lot of information, but might get people think, hey, this is interesting to try to ask questions. So a lot of science demonstrations, making things blow up, and making things change colors, things like that. But science communication can also be about questioning science, about asking what's the role of science in society, about why do we make decisions based on what scientists say instead of based on what politicians say in some countries? What are the ways that science doesn't always give us a clear answer? Why are there controversies in science? What are there questions that maybe science isn't the best tool for getting answers to? These are all also part of science communication. So it can be a very critical field. In, let's say, the environmental field, science may not be able to give you answers about how to combat the forces of large corporations in whose interests it's easier to pollute rather than to clean up the water or the air. Science may give you some of the information you need, but it may not be the tool that you most need to address that problem. So we need to understand that science communication is everything from getting people excited to questioning science and questioning whether science is even the right tool to be using.
And I think the term science communication is quite some sort of new and unfamiliar to most people. And what is the difference between this kind of popular science and science communication, public understanding of science? Are they all the same, or do they have differences?
Yeah, so people use different terms. When I first started in this field in the 90s, people usually referred to science literacy or public understanding of science. Some of my earliest research was finding out that when people say public understanding of science, what they actually mean is public appreciation of the benefits that science provides to society. And I don't disagree with the fact that science provides benefits to society, but I think there's more to it, as I suggested, than that. In more recent years, people have used public engagement with science or public communication of science and technology. Each of those terms has a slight nuance, and of course, I'm only speaking in English. If I were to be looking in other countries, so in Spanish, for example, you can say divulgación, which is divulging information, so conveying information. But you can also say apropiación social de las ciencias, social appropriation of science. That's a very different sense of who's in control and why are they doing it. In India, the national constitution refers to every citizen's obligation to develop a scientific temper, which is something about incorporating science into your life. In French, a term that's often used is culture scientifique, scientific culture. But in English, it doesn't mean the same thing as it does in English. Culture scientifique refers to the idea that we live in a culture with science all the way through it. Science is just part of our culture, and it's all around us. That's a very different thing than saying divulgación, conveying science information, or popular science, making science popular. So all of these terms have nuances that are different and are worth exploring. That's what I enjoy exploring. On the other hand, I also don't want us to get stuck in the terminology. If somebody wants to call it outreach instead of public engagement, fine. If they want to call it public engagement instead of science literacy, fine. Better to just be doing it. But it's worth thinking about those differences. It's worth spending time reflecting on, okay, so what is the difference between outreach and public engagement? Outreach clearly is one way. I'm reaching out. Public engagement implies that there's something back and forth going on. It may be that your goals are to do outreach, are to just let people know what you're doing. That's fine. It may be that your goals are to find out from public audiences what their interests are. That would be more public engagement. That's also good. So I think it's useful to reflect on these different terms and on the nuanced differences between them. It's also important to just get out there and do it and to not get stuck in the self-reflection.
And how this kind of the field of science communication changed from the past to the present, and how is science communication today, and how do you envision like the future of that field of science communication?
Well, there clearly have been lots of changes. I think in the idea, there have been people who've done public communication of science, scientists who've talked about their work for hundreds of years. The field started developing as a profession early in the 20th century, where there were people who, that was their job, was to communicate about science with non-scientists. And mostly they thought about that as teaching people science, making sure people knew what the latest scientific developments were. Beginning after World War II, science for people in the United States or Western Europe, World War II was understood as the war that science won because of the atomic bomb, radar, jet engines. Obviously, I'm speaking from a particular perspective, right? Different countries might have a different perspective on what the outcome of the war was. There was an understanding then both that science was critical. Without science, the Western powers would not have won the war, but also that some of the outcomes were things we had to question. The atomic bomb, the problems of radiation, the problems of the potential destruction of the world by military powers that were using science. And many scientists who were involved, especially in the development of the atomic bomb, were quite worried about, did people know enough about science and about both what it could do and what it couldn't do, and what the boundaries and what the challenges were. So that led in the years after World War II to a lot more attention to science journalism, science museums, building resources. And this was true both in the United States, which is the case that I know the best. It was certainly true in Western Europe, to some extent true in other economically developed countries, Australia, to some extent Japan and China as they developed. But we actually don't know very well what the contours of the development of science communication is outside the Western developed countries. So there's actually a lot still to learn there. And I hope some of the people listening to this will go explore that.
Yeah.
Obviously, because it was scientists who'd been involved in the military, there was a lot of military support or defense support for science communication. So the U.S. Department of Energy put a lot of money in. NASA did a lot of science communication in the 90s and 60s and 70s. Now, of course, that was partly about the excitement of going to the moon and of exploring space. But if you know the history of know anything about the history of NASA, although it's presented as a civilian program, it was developed by the United States because it was worried about the Soviet Union and and it was part of the Cold War race for control of resources and control of space and of the moon and so on. So it's very hard to disentangle the sort of military defense elements of this and the science is cool, science is neat, let's just explore science. These things are meshed, and that was part of what was happening. By the 1980s, some of the challenges that science presents were becoming much clearer. The military implications, for example, the United States used pesticides in Vietnam, widespread, and many scientists were upset that their work was being used to do that. Many people who were in the United States who were critical of the war attacked scientists for being part of what in the United States is called the military-industrial complex. The environmental movement began to grow in the 1970s as people realized what our modern industrial world is doing to the earth. So people started being critical of the science that leads to some of those technologies. So science communication became more complex. It became not just teach people science, but also ask some of these questions about science, figure out what some of the concerns are. At the same time that all of this is happening, and I'd say that sort of trend has continued since the 1980s. At the same time, through this period, early 20th century to the present time, so 125 years now, media itself has been changing. The tools of communication have been changing. In the early days, it was basically newspapers, magazines, and books, printed materials. Some of the first science movies appeared in the 1920s. Actually, as is well known, one of the very first movies was about going to the moon. It was a science fiction movie, but it had to do with doing that. But so you started getting movies, and then science became part of radio very early on. There was science as television developed in the 1940s and 50s. Science was a part of it. In many countries, radio and television were controlled by the government. They were not, in the United States, they're independent commercial exercises. But in many countries, they're controlled by the government, and governments had an interest in educating people about science and technology. So they were on those media, blockbuster movies that had science in them about interstellar and meteors, things like that. I'm not even talking about science fiction, which is its own separate, but not entirely unrelated area. One of the most famous science fiction writers of the post-war period was Isaac Asimov, who's famous for his science fiction. He's also famous for the fact that he published something like 400 books in his lifetime. What many people don't realize is most of those books were his non-science fiction books. They were about science and other topics. And that's actually what he spent most of his time doing. He actually, after his initial very creative period in science fiction in the 1950s, for the next 30 or 40 years, mostly he wrote books explaining science. So these things get mixed in. In the 90s, with the development of the internet and especially the World Wide Web, which was a different way of accessing the internet, now suddenly anybody could be producing information and posting it. So we get a whole new ecology of who's producing information. How do we have to judge that information? How do we decide what's good information and what's not? With the development of smartphones in the late first decade of the 2000s, so let's say 2010, it's a little before then, but they become widespread after about 2010. Suddenly everybody has access to all kinds of information about science and anything else in their hands. It's important to know that this is not just a characteristic of the wealthy industrialized countries. In many countries, especially in Africa, I don't know as much about Asia, there was very poor telephone service because it's expensive to string wires across vast geographic areas. But cell phones and eventually smartphones are actually much easier to implement because all you need is a radio tower. So you need power at one location, not across lots of locations. So cell phones actually developed much more quickly in less developed countries than they did in the United States and to some extent Europe. So there's new information ecologies, and cell phone, even before smartphones, cell phones were used for conveying science and technical information. People would get weather information or information about new crops or things like that. So all of that develops. So it's both new ways of getting information and then new people producing the information. That changes, and we still don't fully understand. And then, of course, in the last 10 years or so, the rise of much more visual information, videos like this one, TikTok, Reels, all kinds of social media, Instagram, Twitter/X, or Blue Sky, or any of the others. So there's been this dramatic change in how much information is out there, in people's ability to get access to information, but also new challenges that come with that about selecting what's good information, what's not. All of that is about media. There's a whole other story to be told about museums, which beginning in the 70s, basically, well, there's examples, again, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, but beginning largely in the 1970s, you have the interactive, hands-on science museums. Beginning in the 1990s, you have citizen science, where citizens become part of the scientific process, gathering information and submitting it into the scientific community, or the scientific community gets recruited by communities to help them solve a problem using citizen science. So there's just this explosion of new opportunities and new ways of doing science communication, having to think about how those things all intersect.
And you talked about the kind of this explosion of the books, explosion of the movies, and
Can
a
you
lot
speak
of...
up?
Okay. And I'm not really familiar with I wasn't really familiar with the historical movies and the books you told, but I've heard a lot about the Bill Nye the Science Guy, the show, which I got interested in like probably 1 year ago, and I think it was quite historical. And when I heard some of the science communicators that on YouTube, this Veritasium, Physics Goals, some sort of YouTubers, they told that this show was a kind of inspiration for them to pursue science at that time. And then there was not like many kind of, this TV show actually like inspired their love for science. Yeah, and what do you say about the show? And I think Bill Nye was also from Cornell. Like, I searched his background. He was from Cornell. And what do you say about it?
Yes, we're very proud. Here at Cornell, we're very proud of Bill Nye. He's one of our more important alumni. I think it's actually, I want to back up a little bit and talk. I remember I said that initially magazines and books were particularly important. There have always been a series of books that were especially influential that that turned people on to science, that said, wow, science could be exciting. I want to be a scientist. In the 90s, there was a book called Microbe Hunters by a microbiologist named Paul de Cruyff. And if you talk to people who became scientists in the 1950s, 40s, and 50s, they would all tell you, I read Paul de Cruyff's book when I was a kid and I wanted to become a scientist. The 1960s, as molecular biology was beginning to develop, and James Watson wrote his book called The Double Helix, which was about how you could be young and dashing and exciting and be in the laboratory in the morning and discover world-changing things, and then in the afternoon go play tennis, and in the evening go to the bar. That made science seem exciting, and there's a whole bunch of people who became scientists in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, who, if you ask them, how did you become a scientist? They say, I read Double Helix, and that made me want to become a scientist. One of my former Cornell colleagues, former only because he died many years ago, Carl Sagan, the astronomer, he wrote several books, and then in 1980 did a television series called Cosmos, which has been seen by somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people around the world. And if you talk to people in the 80s and 90s, why did they want to become a scientist? Because they saw Cosmos. So it was, which was both a book and a TV series. So there's always been this series of inspirational media that really turned people on. Bill Nye was an undergraduate in engineering here at Cornell. He took Carl Sagan's course right about the time that Sagan was producing the Cosmos series. And Bill Nye went on to become an engineer. He worked for the Boeing aircraft company, and he designed, I don't forget what it is, part of the hydraulic brake system in 747 or something like that. But he had always been interested in performing and in comedy. And in his local comedy club, he developed this character he called Bill Nye the Science Guy. And it got picked up on a local radio station and then by a local TV, and eventually became a nationwide series. The Bill Nye the Science Guy show was on the air in the middle 1990s, so 30 years ago. But of course it was recorded, and so clips of it have been used ever since, particularly in schools, because although when you watch the Bill Nye show, it's this frenetic, rapidly moving thing. He's always jumping about. He's a very hyperactive person, which actually he is in person as well. It is an accurate reflection of his personality. He very carefully, when he did that show, there were learning objectives for every show. He knew what he wanted people to go away with, to take away from the shows. That makes them particularly useful for use in schools. So as video became part of the teaching technique in the 1990s and 2000s and 2000 teens, teachers learned to use those videos as teaching tools. So if I ask my students today, how many of you saw Bill Nye shows when you were kids, everybody's hands go up. And then I say, did you watch them at home or did you watch them in school? And almost all of them watched them in school. That was where they saw Bill Nye. So those inspirational shows are really important. There are a couple of other shows like that. There was one called Beekman's World. There's a show called Magic School Bus with Mrs. Frizzle that a lot of people watch. One of the things we don't know is, in the new internet age, what are people being inspired by? What are the video logs, vlogs or TikTok channels or Instagram channels that people are finding inspirational? We know a few of them. There's one on Facebook. It's called IFLS. It actually has a swear word in the name, so I'm not going to say it. But IFLS Science. Some people don't like it because it's tidbits. There's no big arching theme. But it has. The last time I checked, it was tens of millions of followers on Facebook and showing up in other people's feeds. And so people see that and say, "Wow, cool! So science is cool." So it has certain kinds of achievements. So there's always been these inspirational moments.
Yeah. And I think these days is also really prominent science communication, the channel, the platform is I think Huberman Lab, and I think he has been sharing the insights about this field, the neuroscience, a lot from, I think, 5 or 10 years. And it's also really inspiring. And even like students in Uzbekistan who are learning English will definitely like watch some podcasts of Huberman Lab, not only because they want to learn language, but also the insights and the like information they will get are incredibly insightful. Okay, and I wanted to ask a question about, so we talked what is science communication, and what do you think, Professor Lewenstein, why we need to spread science? Why we need science communication in the first place, and why it is important, and how it is actually spread? And we talked about the media, and what are some of the milestones in science that happened, for example, in many scientists? For example, how was the science in Isaac Newton's life, before Isaac Newton? How was science before Einstein? And how was science during Galileo's time? And what do you think about this kind of the talk about our history of science?
Yeah. So we're now going to get a little bit theoretical in what I talk about. So I've talked so far as if there is science and then it's communicated. But in fact, when we look more historically, conceptually, communication is a fundamental part of science itself. Some people call it the essence. Communication is the essence of science. And you can actually see that with people like Galileo, or compare Galileo to Leonardo da Vinci. So Galileo, brilliant scientist, and he wrote his books. Some of his books were written in Italian rather than in Latin, specifically so that they would be available to a wider audience, but where he was working out his ideas. Da Vinci, who lived, I guess, about 100 years before, 50 or 100 years before Galileo, was also brilliant. Leonardo da Vinci was brilliant. But his scientific achievements, mostly more engineering achievements, he was so concerned about priority and about preserving his ownership that he wrote them all down in coded writing. You have to hold it up to a mirror and decode the codes in order to read it. And so, while we know of Da Vinci today as as an artist, he would, and a few historians know about him as an engineer and a scientist. He's not known as a scientist because his ideas did not become part of a broader conversation because he didn't communicate them. Communication is how science gets to be talked about, how people get their ideas out there and get feedback and decide where to develop them and which ones are interesting and so on. So it becomes very interesting to look at science communication as a fundamental part of what science is, not just public communication of science, but communication just in general. There have been examples of scientists who used public communication to get out ideas that they were having trouble getting out through their traditional scientific means. So, for example, the astronomer Fred Hoyle, mid-century cosmologist, brilliant, helped develop some of our core ideas in astronomy. He also had ideas that ran against the scientific mainstream. He actually invented the word the Big Bang Theory, not to explain the expansion of the universe, but it was actually, he was trying to make fun of that idea because he believed in what was called a steady state universe. And scientists didn't agree with him, and he couldn't get some of his work published. And so he started writing science fiction novels in order to get some of his ideas out for public discussion that he was having trouble getting out through the scientific literature. The movie Twister that came out in the 1980s, I think. One of the elements of that movie is the scientist develops an instrument that can get picked up by the cyclone and used to measure the inside of the cyclone. Well, actually, that instrument did not exist, but the scientists who were consultants to the movie had long thought that it would be cool to have such an instrument, and they deliberately wrote it into the script, or asked the writers to write it into the script, because they hoped that that would get enough attention to the idea that they would then be able to go get the funding that they needed to develop the actual instrument. So there's this interaction between the public communication and the science and the development of the ideas in science itself that that I think is really it's really interesting. It's one of the areas we still need to know a lot more about. It's where I thought my career was going to go, but I ended up doing something different. More of my work has been out on the public side, but I'm still interested in that interaction piece.
Yeah. And I familiarized myself and I read one of your books, When Science Meets Public. And one of the chapters I became really interested was the strategies in science communication. And one of them was producer-audience communication. Producer-audience communication. And what is producer-audience communication? And what are the other communication strategies you will tell us?
So I think the key thing is that it's been so long since I've read the book, I can't remember the chapters. It was one of my first books.
It was like audience at the beginning, producer-audience communication.
Yeah, so it's the idea of audience-centered communication. So one of the fundamental rules in any kind of communication is to think about your audience. We often say that's the most important thing to talk about, to think about. Who are you trying to reach? And then and then think about, well, what can I communicate about with them, right? If I'm trying to reach kindergarten students, it's a very different thing than trying to talk to high school students or to young parents, right? Those are different audiences, different things. Now, one of my former students named John Besley, who's at Michigan State University, he and some other colleagues point out that actually you have to think about strategy first. They think you should think about strategy first, which is what are you trying to accomplish, and then choose your audience that is the right one for accomplishing that. So if your goal is to explain nuclear physics, it doesn't matter. It's not worth talking to the kindergarten students. If your goal is to excite people to explore scientific careers, it's probably not worth talking to the young parents because they're already in their careers. So you have to think about your strategy. What's your goal? What's your strategy for achieving that goal, and then doing that. With the audience, once you've identified your audience, whichever way you get there, then you really need to think about what they already know, because they're not blank slates. They already have a lot of knowledge. Some of it might be right, some of it might be wrong, but you're trying to figure out how to help them achieve this goal. If I could, I'm actually going to sidestep a little bit here and talk about what are those possible goals. So about 15 years ago, we did a report on learning science in informal settings, informal environments, learning science in informal environments. It was a committee report from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And in that report, we identified we called them strands of learning. So there are 4 strands of learning that if you think about a school, you do. You learn the content. You learn just the physics knowledge. There's the methods. You learn how to develop that knowledge and how to do things. There's reflection. Part of learning is learning to think about what you've learned and to reflect on it. We know from learning theory that that's part of how we learn, is we stop to think about what. And then the 4th strand in that category is just going out and doing it. Actually, not just theoretically learning the methods, but actually going out and doing it, hands-on experience.
Yeah.
So that's what happens in school. In informal environments, there's those 4. There's a preliminary one, and then I can't get my hands to go this way, but a 5th one. So there's 5. There's 6 learning strands. Yeah, maybe that's a better way to do it, like that. There we go. Now I get 6. Before you even get to the content, you have to be excited to learn. We all know that you learn best when you're excited. And you know that your best teachers are the ones who get you excited about science. In informal environments like the media or social media or science museums or community activities, that's where you get excited, right? Because you don't have to do any of those things, but you choose to do them. One of my colleagues calls that free choice learning. It's when you choose to go out on a nature walk, or you choose to watch videos, or you choose to go to the science museum. All right, your parents forced you to go to the science museum, but you choose to spend time at that exhibit. It's still not it's still basically a free choice. And so you get excited. The sixth strand, that last strand, is that you develop a science identity. You develop an identity as someone who can learn science, which is not something that's traditional, right? Many people, if you talk to many people who are in their 20s or their 30s or later, and you tell them that you're involved in science, and they say, the last time I took science was in high school, I just barely passed, and I'm so
Yeah,
glad I never have to do that again. Even as a student, you've probably already met friends like that.
yeah.
Those are people who think they can't learn science, that they won't be able to learn science. But with good science communication, people learn that they can learn about science. Oh, this is actually interesting. There's stuff here that I want to know. And so that's actually the sixth strand of learning. So the six strands become getting excited, learning content, learning methods, reflecting, doing it hands on, and then realizing that you can, learning that you can learn.
Identity. Yeah.
And those strands all interweave. We call them strands because it's like the strands of a rope. Yes, they're individual, but when you put them all together, they're much, much stronger.
That was really insightful. And we talked about the post World War II science communication already. Let's transition to informal science learning. We talked a little bit about informal science education, but let's go a little bit deeper. As the name suggests, it is informal science learning. And what is, like, for audiences who are not familiar with that term, with that like terminology and that information, what is informal science learning? And well, informal science learning is not that much popular in Uzbekistan, in Central Asian countries, but I think it's really popular in Western, and actually in US. And can you talk a lot more about this?
Yeah, so that's sort of what I was just talking about the strands of learning. So we talk about formal learning, formal schooling. That's what happens in the school. I see that you're sitting in a room with a blackboard behind you, right?
Yeah.
That's probably a schoolroom. That's formal schooling. But it turns out that if you think about your life from the time you're born until the time you retire, or after retire when you're an old person, and you think about a day as having about 16 hours in the day, because the other 8 hours you're sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And if you draw that as a diagram, so 16 hours, 80 years. From the time you're born until you're 5, there's almost no formal schooling. Then until you're about 18, there's maybe 6 hours out of the 16. And then after that, maybe in college, university, you have a little bit more. But then after that, for the rest of your life, there's just a very thin line. You have almost no formal school. Think of that. The formal schooling is in one color. Everything else in that big rectangle is a different color. It's that big rectangle that stands out. That's all informal learning, because you just have that little bit of formal learning. So informal learning is what happens when you are cooking and you realize that there's something about the proportion of ingredients that you mix. It's what happens when you're walking to work and you hear a bird and you pay attention to what the different birds are. It's what happens when you're looking at a river when there's been a lot of rain and you see the bank of the river being carved away by the heavy river stream, and you have to think about how that affects long-term things. It's what happens when you go to a science museum or when you're flipping through your social media feed and you see stories that are about science findings. Those are all informal learning. And that was the purpose of our study, was to try to understand what's happening in those settings, and that's where those six strands come from. But the key thing is there can be tension between formal schooling, which takes a lot of resources and should take a lot of resources, and it's critical that our societies invest in formal schooling for everybody, not just for smart kids, but for all kids. But it turns out that we also need to invest in these informal settings. So we need to invest in science museums. We need to invest in nature centers at parks. We need to invest in having guides who can be at the parks to help you see things and learn things that are happening there. We need to invest in social media. So part of what the importance of informal learning is recognizing that it is a huge part of our lives and therefore deserves investment and attention.
Yeah. And in Uzbekistan, especially in Uzbekistan, like from my country's perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on language learning, but there's less emphasis on science, informal science education. The formal science education is really good because our curriculum is grounded in Soviet Union science curriculum. It's very theoretical. It's very, like it's kind of a level at the AP American physics level and like science levels, courses levels. But the informal science education is not that much emphasized. There's little emphasis on science education in media, social media, because you can see like TV channels dedicated to learning language, but there's no any channels like maybe even TV shows dedicated to science learning. And I think the Central Asia should emphasize more on this informal science learning.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is part of what we've found, why it's so important to think about that rectangle of time and realize how much of our time is outside of school. And therefore, so many more opportunities for learning about science, but we have to provide those opportunities, and so we have to invest in them.
And let's transition to one of the exciting parts of our interview. It is like citizen science. What is citizen science, and why it is important for scientific research, and when is it originated?
Yeah, so citizen science is this amazing field that's developed in the last 30 years. Although, again, as a historian, I can go back hundreds of years that people have been collecting science information and collating it for the use of science. So one of the very first things that happened in the United States when we were founded 250 years ago was we set up a weather service. Of course, the United States is a very large geographic area. Even then it was big, smaller than it is now, but much bigger. And there was no way the government could have weather observers every place. So they set up a system where local people could send in their weather observations, and that became the beginnings of our understanding of weather patterns. In the 1840s, there was a naval officer in the United States, his name was Matthew Maury, who realized that ship captains keep very careful records of wind and weather and ocean currents, and that if you collected all that, you would actually have a wonderful scientific database of the weather of the oceans. And so he had all of that collected, and that became some of the bases of our modern understanding of oceanography. Astronomers for years, amateur astronomers, have often been the ones who find new stars, new novas, new meteors, new planets, things like that. In the 1990s, so there have been for again over 100 years, bird watchers have been collecting observations of how many birds were seen. In the United States, there was something called the Christmas bird count. On Christmas Day, everybody would go out, record what birds they saw, send that in to the Audubon Society, and that would become a sort of database of science. So beginning in the 90s, they began to formalize that. And a colleague of mine here at Cornell, Rick Bonney, came up with the name citizen science. And so these are projects where scientists would design a study that they needed more data than they could get with a professor and 6 graduate students. They needed everybody, tens of thousands of people, to send in their observations. And this became the scientific database, initially just for birds, but now these things exist for river quality and fish populations and coral reef degradation. I mean, all lots of areas of science. Some of it is online. There's a site called Zooniverse that has a collection of projects, some of which are astronomy related, some of which are wildlife related, many different topics. These are what are called top-down citizen science projects, where the the scientists design the project and they recruit people to help provide data and sometimes to help with the analysis. There are also bottom-up projects where a community says, we have a problem. We have, let's say, a water quality problem in our river, and we want to have more data, and we ask scientists to help us design a project where we can gather the data, and they'll just help us make sure we're gathering it systematically and that we're able to analyze it. So these are more community-based projects, and there are increasing number of these. And it turns out that in the same year that Rick Bonney came up with the term citizen science, a sociologist of science named Alan Irwin, thinking about these community-driven projects and the need to think about them have communities drive discussions about sustainability and about governance of science, he published a book called Citizen Science. So we actually have these two kinds of citizen science developed at the same time. I know Rick and Alan, they have met. They forgot to take a picture of themselves together when they met. So we don't actually have a picture of these two citizen science pioneers. But there are these couple of different meanings of citizen science, the gathering of data and the citizen governance of science. They come together in many ways. And in fact, the field of citizen science has recently developed new terminology referring to itself more as participatory science rather than citizen science, because not everybody who participates is a citizen.
And I found out that there is kind of this bird citizen science project in Cornell around the topic of birds. Yeah. Can you talk, was the pioneer, who has created it, and is it still running, and how does the process work?
Yeah. Actually, the lab of ornithology, which is a unit here at Cornell, has been collecting data about birds for, I don't know, 100 years or so. And it's been in slightly different forms. They were developing these citizen science projects where they had this Christmas bird count, and then they had a project called Project Feeder Watch, where they would have people watch their feeders, their bird feeders, following a specific protocol of how to count for a certain amount of time, how many birds come to your feeder, what species are they, and then you would report that on what we used to call bubble sheets, little sheets of paper where you filled in a bubble, and then you sent in the paper, and it would be scanned, and a computer could analyze it. Beginning in the 90s, when the internet developed, and this is important, this is where some of these historical trends come together, they realized that instead of having people fill in bubble sheets, they could have them fill in a form online, and that would become the database. That suddenly opened up access not just to people who received the sheets, but now anybody could log in. And they realized that they could do this for more than just the Feeder Watch project. There were other projects they could do. And so they developed something called eBird, which is a scientific database. Anybody who watches birds can log in and say, I saw this bird in this location on this date, and this is what the weather was like, and I forget what other information. And that becomes a massive database of bird populations that people can use to track bird disease, bird populations, migration trends, other kinds of ornithological studies. There are all kinds of safeguards built in to make sure the data is good and can be tested and so on. But they've demonstrated that the data is at least as good, if not better, than what professional ornithologists gather, and that they can make management decisions with it, they can track diseases, and so on. And that has now spread to other fields as well.
Yeah, and as a student who is doing some sort of physics outreaches, physics demonstrations, what kind of citizen science projects I can do in Uzbekistan? Because I got really inspired, I got really encouraged to do that activity, to introduce that field to Uzbekistan. Maybe there are some in academia, but I haven't seen that. What kind of projects I can do in physics?
So I don't know specifically, but there are two places where I would look. So I would look at zooniverse.org, which is this compilation of online projects. Most of them are entirely online, but I think there may be some that can be Zooniverse. So I just put it in the chat. Zooniverse are these online ones. And there's another one which is mostly US focused, but is a good place to start, called scistarter.org. That's much more focused on the kind of projects that are in person, not online, but you can get instructions for projects. They have ways you can filter. I would filter for physics and see what happens, and see what kinds of projects are there. There is a European Citizen Science Association.
Mm-hmm.
I know Uzbekistan is not Europe, it's further east, but there are people in Europe who are thinking more broadly and thinking about Asian. I don't know. I don't think there's an Asian Citizen Science Association, but if you can, there's a Chinese one, there's probably an Indian one, but I don't know about more broadly. But if you go to what used to be called the Citizen Science Association, it's now called the Association for the Advancement of Participatory Science, pull up there. Those are where the resources would be to start tracking down some of these things.
And many people were curious about, like, when I posted on social media the post of our interview. They were really curious about the Cornell in general. So let's talk about, like, a little bit about Cornell, maybe. And you launched the Science Communication and Public Engagement minor in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. What motivated you to create it?
Yeah. So it wasn't really me. I was part of the project. It was really a colleague of mine, Dr. Mark Sharvari, who teaches our investigative biology courses, but also teaches courses in science communication, especially using web-based techniques and so on. He was really the person who spearheaded this project, and he realized that we had people, although I was the person who's called the professor of science communication, we actually had people teaching science communication in many places around the university. We're a big university. We have, depending on how you count, 12 or 13 colleges that are part of the university. 3 very big ones, the College of Arts and Sciences, which is a traditional liberal arts college, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, which is more biology, life sciences focused, agricultural focused, College of Engineering, which is traditional engineering college. But we also have schools of computer science and veterinary science. So we had science all over the place, and we had people teaching science communication courses. So what we did, what Mark helped us organize, was we realized we had students who were interested in science communication, who had on their own found these individual courses and taken them. And what we did was pull it together in a way so that a student who's interested in science communication could say, here's a set of courses you can take and a choices within those groups to help. If you're interested more in the science policy side, you might want to take these courses. If you were more interested in what is science, here's a set of courses. If you're more interested in video, here's a set of courses. And the way Cornell is structured, students are enrolled in a college and they have a major area of study within that college, and that's their primary focus. But they can also have a minor, which is some other field where they're taking a structured set of courses. So the Science Communication and Public Engagement minor is one of those minors, and we set it up so that it exists across colleges. So students from different colleges can all be in the same minor. We're graduating between 2 and 5 students a year in the minor. It got started during COVID, so it was, of course, a little challenging. But literally, we announced the minor in January 2020, and of course, COVID hit us all in February and March. But even that year, in May of 2020, we had 2 students graduate in the minor because they had already taken all the courses that were part of this new minor. And one of them has gone on to a science career. One of them has gone on to a science communication career. So we're seeing those as possibilities.
And for students who may be interested in science communication, what are the careers they may pursue in the future?
Yeah, there's all kinds of careers. So obviously, they can go into being a science journalist or working in a science museum. A lot of people go to work for hospitals or pharmaceutical research companies or chemical research companies where they become part of the communications department or the marketing department, helping explain the science of those fields. We've had people go into branches of education. One person who was in the minor worked for an online learning company and helped them develop and market their courses that are science oriented. So not for people getting degrees, but people who just wanted to take a science course or to learn about a new field. We've had people, definitely some science journalists. One of our recent graduates is a very high-powered science journalist doing investigative journalism about science topics. People can go to work for government agencies as public information officers or colleges and universities for public information officers. So there's a whole range of things they can do.
Yeah. And in general, what kind of students Cornell Arts and Science College look for? Because if you apply to colleges, I know that Cornell, you will apply to specific college of the Cornell, unlike many other universities like Harvard. But in Cornell, you will apply to specific colleges and you will have several supplemental SL, you'll have several prompts dedicated to each college. What kind of students does each college, maybe let's say firstly Arts and Science College, look for? And also you are part of also Agriculture and Life Science College. What kind of student do they look for?
Yeah, so primarily we're looking for bright, exciting, interesting students. There isn't a specific profile. The colleges are different. So in arts and sciences, you apply to the college. You may express some interest, but your first 2 years of a 4-year program, you will be exploring across the arts and sciences, humanities, social sciences, and you only declare your major at the end of your second year. That's when you say, okay, I'm going to specialize in economics or biology or physics or history of science or whatever. So it's much more organized in the classical liberal arts tradition of you learn everything. Yes, you specialize, but you have a really broad base. We're looking for students who have curiosity across many topics. Obviously, students have to be very good students. There's not a specific cutoff point or something like that. But we're looking for students who represent very different kinds of traditions. So definitely an interest in international students who bring different experiences and who have not just been preparing for college, but have also tried to do other things like producing the physics project, things like that. We have students who've been explorers or have been part of chamber orchestras, people who have been inventors or have already published a book, or not every student. There's only a few of those. Most are not like that. But we're looking for exciting, interesting students who want to learn. That's primarily what we're looking for. In the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, it's a slightly different. You apply to a specific major, and your program is very much oriented around that major, that specialty subject. You do take some broader courses. We do expect you to take courses in arts and sciences and social sciences more generally, but it's a slightly different educational philosophy. But again, we're still looking for students who are exciting and interesting and show initiative and show a desire to learn.
And in Uzbekistan, there is kind of this admissions mania, like in Central Asia in general, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and many Central Asian countries. Our students right now, I'm witnessing it from 10s, we have schools that runs until 11th grade, but from 10th or 9th grade, they will start learning English, they will start taking certificates of English proficiency, and then they will take SAT exams. And if they have if they took the SAT earlier on, they will dive into AP exams. Although there are 1 or 2 AP centers in Uzbekistan, but there is still some interest, especially there has been explosion this year. And what do you think, what is the consideration, how Cornell colleges consider this kind of academic side of the students, or do MIT, like there has been one student from MIT who got into MIT from Uzbekistan, mostly prioritizes kind of academic achievements. But what about Cornell? What is the kind of, how it looks at SAT and AP exams?
Yeah.
Does it prefer much more some sort of exploration, the intellectual curiosity of a student rather than SAT? And like, how is internationals in Cornell colleges actually are academically, are they really academically intensive, or have they been really interested in one specific niche of their interest?
Yeah. So there's not a single answer to that. We have some students who have been, they've been doing biology since they were 5 years old, and that's all they do, but they're amazing, right? They're going to win the Nobel. Clearly, there's somebody who's going to win a Nobel Prize. That student is interesting to us. We also have students who have no idea what they want to do in the world. They just want to explore widely, and they're really bright, and they do well on those standardized exams, and that's also interesting. So there's no one answer. We absolutely, all of the elite American universities look at scores. Probably we're going to have to do that even more because of changes in our systems that some of the political changes in our country are leading to. So there's absolutely going to use scores. People have to do well on their scores. But there's not a cutoff. So somebody who, is bright and has gotten acceptable scores, but not superb scores, but has all these other exciting things on their record, they might do well. A student who does perfectly on their scores, but doesn't in their writing, in their essays, show any spark, any interest, any curiosity, they might not do well. They might not get in. So the score doesn't determine everything. It's important, absolutely. People should pay attention. What we're often looking for is what has a student done with the opportunities that they had available. So a student from another country, obviously English was not the primary language. How have they done with it? How have they learned English? How have they done in English? This is an English language school. Someone's going to have to do very well, be able to handle English. So, we want to see, did they go to a school with a good science department? And did they take the most advanced courses they could in science? If they went to a school without a good science department, maybe they still took every science course they could take. It just wasn't very much. But did they do well in the ones that they did? And are they showing their interest in science, maybe by being involved in a citizen science project, or in maybe they've been volunteering at a science center or science museum? Similarly, for language or let's say literature or art, again, what were the educational opportunities they had, and what other things did they do that maybe shows their interest outside of school? So we have what's called a holistic approach to admissions, where we're looking at the whole portfolio. We're not looking at any one thing as the single criteria.
Yeah, and I recalled the Ezra Cornell's quote. I would found an institution where any person can, let me say it clearly.
I would find an institution where any person can find instruction in any subject.
Yeah. And what is does the culture in Cornell truly reflect that motto?
Yeah. So it absolutely does. So it's one of the things we are most proud of. It's not true. You can't study everything here, right? No school can offer every possible topic to every possible person. But it does have two things. One, any person is critical to us. We are much more diverse student body than other elite schools. We have more students across economic difference, across ethnic difference, across religious difference, and we're proud of that. We want that to keep happening. So, because we believe that having diverse students leads to better sharing of ideas and understanding of the range of ideas that are out there, and having to challenge people's ideas and question them and so forth. And that's what makes us a great place. So any person is critical. Any study is trickier because we don't actually cover everything. But it is why we have, as I said, all these colleges. We have a College of Arts and Sciences, but also a College of Agriculture and a College of Engineering. and a College of Computer Science. At the graduate level, a veterinary college, and there are some courses undergraduates. We have a College of Hotel and Business Administration, a College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, a College of Labor Relations, a College of Human Ecology and Design. So all these different things are showing that there's just this incredible diversity of topics that you can take. Some of them more intellectually focused, some of them more practically focused. Again, part of what makes Cornell special is that diversity of subjects means that people have to be able to talk across those differences. You have to be able to be a literature student studying novels in Finnish and being able to, or in Uzbek, um, and being able to talk to somebody who's interested in better corn varieties. And those two students may be roommates in the dormitories. And so they have to be able to talk to each other. And that leads to exciting conversations about why people learn things and what it's worth knowing about in the world, and hopefully generation of new ideas for how we can make the world a better place.
And I think it is one of my final questions. And what do you recommend for high school students, especially high school students, who got interested or maybe who are interested in science communication, science in general, to read, to learn, to gain more understanding, to gain more knowledge about science communication? Where to start? How they can start? What kind of books they may read? Because I'm also curious, what kind of books would you recommend? What kind of resources would you recommend? And I know science communication is a broad field, but what kind of direction, what kind of recommendations would you give?
So at the high school level, I think there's a couple of things. One, continue to take the most challenging science courses you can. Just especially at the high school level, you need to be able to need to know your science if you're going to go into science communication. College level, it's a little bit different. I don't think you have to be a science major, but you still have to be taking a lot of science courses. So that I think that's important. Find those examples that inspire you, whether it's Bill Nye the Science Guy or the IFLS Science Facebook page. Find it.
I found it. 21 million.
Yeah, is that what it was? Okay. Yeah, a huge number.
Yeah.
Find that, follow that. If there's read science biographies, read your favorite popular science. There's no one thing, because everybody's going to be inspired by a different thing. To learn about the field, which is a relatively small field, I think the things that you've already mentioned, the journal JCOM, which is open access and relatively easy for people to get to, is as good an introduction to the field as anything, and see what kinds of articles there are. There's a book that was published by Australian National University in 2020 called Science Communication, A Global Perspective. I think that's the title. Yes. Was published by Australian National University. It's a free download. The PDF is a free download and lets you. Did you find it?
Okay, like science communication, global perspective. Yeah?
Global perspective. Yeah. Here it is. That book will be an introduction to ways of thinking about science communication around the world. So I think there's 40 chapters or something like that, different countries. The International Network on Public Communication of Science and Technology, PCST Network, .pcsd.network, looking through its pages, joining its listserv. You don't think you have to be a paid member to join the listserv. You'll hear what are people talking about, what kinds of topics are interesting to people. The PCST Network has a YouTube channel with all kinds of seminars and presentations and panel discussions. Those can also be, I think, a good thing to see.
And I've been reading Thomas Kuhn's Science, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. What do you say about this book?
So that's a classic book. You can't think about science today without having read that book. The whole field of science and technology studies, STS, which has emerged, that many people there study that, history of science, sociology of science. I think those are important fields. Actually, there's a professor at the University of Vienna named Sarah Davies. She's written or co-authored a couple of books about science communication, which I think are worth looking at. But also just very recently, she's written a book more broadly about science and society that brings up a lot of the STS issues. And I think that's another good book to read as a place to get started, and then follow the citations, see what she cites that sounds interesting and follow those.
Professor Lewenstein, it's been a great, wonderful experience speaking with you, and your contribution to that field is immense. I'm really inspired learning from you, and thank you.
Good luck and enjoy the school year coming up. Bye-bye.